yes, the buttons. And this entire Gingy puppet was created by Taylor.
That's me.
As a character prop for a high school production of Shrek the Musical.
It was quite the process, so I thought I would share some of the challenges and some of the pro tips I learned along the way in case you are also taking this project on. The DIY supply list and time codes for the specific steps are listed in the description below.
Now let's jump into this fairy tale.
Complete with trials and triumphs.
Once upon a time,
there was a director for Shrek the Musical, Austin.
That's me.
Who was in need of a little gingerbread man.
That's me.
For his production. Short on magic, I channeled my crafty confidence and somehow brought Gingy,
that's me,
to life in time for his stage debut. Gingy started as a free pattern from puppetnerd.com. The file size downloads as a normal size sheet of paper, so I took it into Staples and had them enlarge it. Pro tip here, ask if they can print it on architecture paper. It's the perfect size, and I found it to be much cheaper than the options I had online. Before I cut the pattern out, I measured a 1-inch seam allowance all around Gingy. I cut that out first and then traced it onto the fabric. This is where another pro tip comes into hand. I did not get stretchy fabric at all, so I definitely needed a bigger seam allowance than 1 inch, but I'll figure that out in a little bit. I folded my fabric in half and pinned around Gingy and then cut it out, so I only had to cut once. Now that the fabric is cut, we're moving on to the foam body. I ended up ordering double the amount of foam that I actually needed because mistakes happen in crafting and I was gonna be prepared, even though I couldn't be prepared for what's to come. We're celebrating another step done, cutting off the seam allowance and cutting out all of the little details and then tracing the pattern onto the foam. It was helpful to cut out the details now because you can use the pattern as a guide later when decorating Gingy with his features. This is where this project is getting exciting because Gingy went from 2D to 3D. The next step is just to cut out the gingerbread man shape. I did a little research online ahead of time and found that the best way to cut out this foam would be to use an electric knife. I have never used an electric knife in either the food or the craft world, so we're just winging it here. We're learning and looking at the tips online, trying to hold it straight up and down, getting the table just a little bit, but you know, everything was fine. It worked out. I did go in with scissors in the corners because I didn't want to get the electric knife too close and risk having to use my backup piece of foam. Luckily, it doesn't have to be too perfect because we're going to cover it with fabric anyway. Speaking of fabric, this is the part where we are faking it till we make it. I literally haven't used a sewing machine since I was in high school, and let's just say that's been a minute. I was determined to power through this because I did not want to sew this all by hand. I realized pretty quickly that my pins were in backwards, and then I also had some struggles with the thread, being a bit of a rat's nest, but thank goodness for seam rippers because I was able to rip it out and start over until I got it right. Next up, I was cutting the mouthpiece before I flipped it inside out one more time. At this point, I basically have an odd-shaped pillow and a pillowcase. How hard can it be to combine the two? Let me just tell you, it was real hard. The biggest struggle of this whole project. Remember when I mentioned about the seam allowance and the stretchiness of the fabric? Yeah, well, let's just say that those are both factors to consider when you're starting this project. Pro tip, use fabric with some stretch, or give yourself lots of seam allowance, or adjust the thickness of the foam you're using. I was fully determined to make this process work. I didn't want to waste any of the time and effort that I had already spent on getting this far. Determination will certainly get you places because after almost an hour of struggling with this, I got it. I got the foam to fit within the fabric. I stitched up the opening by hand, and then once I got that done, I realized that it was looking a little tight in places. At this point, I was going to have to get creative and think outside the box because I was not going to start over. So I cut the seams and I put a little patch in there. I hot glued the patch in and then I used clear nail polish to help with the seams so that it wouldn't come undone. And honestly, it held up really well. On to the next challenge of the project, and that is making the mouth mechanism. It was very important for this that the mouth would move and that Gingy would talk from being on stage, because Gingy is most definitely a character bringing the energy to the stage. I had it in my mind that I was going to use a pool noodle for the mouth, but it ended up being too rigid, so I scrapped it. I ended up using the same foam that I did for the body, and it worked perfectly. The biggest challenge of the mouth mechanism was these mouth plates, trying to get it so that the actor would actually be able to utilize Gingy like a puppet. I did end up using this inside of the mouthpiece for later when I actually figured out how to make the mouth move. This process wasn't a total lost cause, but this is definitely where the trials came into place. I did a lot of time-consuming hand sewing where I stitched the lips to the inner mouthpiece and of course seam ripped and restitched again, back and forth, until I finally figured out a mechanism that worked. With this type of mouthpiece, for me, I was not able to get the mouth to move as big as I wanted, and we wanted to definitely make sure everyone in the back of the audience could see that Gingy was talking. Thankfully, at this point, my cat Pepper stepped in to be an emotional support, because this is the last version of this mouth plate that I tried. We even brought this version to the school to have the student work with, and it wasn't it. It was not giving what it needed to, so we scrapped it and went a whole other direction. It was time for a much needed break on the mouth mechanism madness, so I decided it was time to make some of the decorations that go on Gingy. Starting with the eyes, I used a button craft cover kit, mostly to get the size that I was looking for, and then this white fabric is actually just a handkerchief. It was like the cheapest way to get white fabric. I glued it in just to make sure, and then I utilized the button cover kit kind of how it was supposed to be used. Remember, we're crafty over here, not always perfectly technical. The eyebrows were hand drawn and then cut out of a thin piece of plastic, just extra plastic that I had hanging around, and then covered with a blue handkerchief fabric. I then laid all the accessories out to kind of mark where I wanted them to go and started sewing on the eyes. This really started to give the gingerbread man some personality. He was really coming to life as Gingy. And as a reminder, this is going on the stage. It was going for a 2-week run. So not only did I end up sewing the eyes on, but I also put a little hot glue under the eyes as well, just to make sure they were gonna stay. Back to the mouth mechanism part of the project, because we definitely couldn't avoid this forever. Like I mentioned, we did some test runs, we did some trials to see how it was working with both the student who was going to operate the puppet, but also just to see how well it was working, how well we could see the movement. And this is where I finally decided to use foam for the lip part. It really made it move a lot more. You could see it from a lot farther. It just had a little bit more movement than the foam noodle did. The red fabric that I'm using is actually a thrifted beanie. The color was perfect and I liked the texture. Cue the game changer of the mouth mechanism, the chip clip. After scrapping the original mouth plates, I went back to YouTube to try to figure out how I was gonna get this mouth mechanism to work. Finally, I found a video where someone had used a chip clip, which I thought was genius because it's already a working mechanism. The ends of the chip clip did have to be cut off in order to make it fit with the existing mouthpiece, but after that I just glued the foam lips around it, and then I did a lot of trial runs. I did a lot of test runs because I wanted to make sure this would be the final time. I took the red fabric and put it around the lips so that it was all one piece, and I pinned it together before stitching it this time to make sure that it was gonna work before I finally stitch it together for one final time. Thankfully, I had an audience of one with my emotional support cat, and she agreed that this was gonna work. With my crafty confidence restored, I started hand stitching the red fabric around the new and improved mouth mechanism. With the movement now achieved, I moved on to the inside of the mouth. I was able to use the fabric from earlier. I just added an extra seam and then cut the back to look like tails. That way the illusion wouldn't be ruined and you couldn't see the chip clip. This inner mouthpiece was attached with hot glue, but it got a little bit messy. So I just covered the dried hot glue with Sharpie and then painted over it with clear nail polish to make sure that it would stay. With the functioning mouth mechanism finally complete, it was time to install it. It did require some of the foam to be trimmed on the back just to make sure that there was enough room for the actor's hands in order to manipulate the puppet and make the mouth move. I made sure to take my time during this part and I snipped the foam and the fabric as needed. I hot glued the mechanism in and really just took it little by little. With the mouth mechanism finally figured out, it's gumdrop button time. Yes, the gumdrop buttons. The fabric I used is a fat quarter from a fabric store. I just looked around until I found the right purple that I was looking for. And then for the actual shape, these are pin cushions from the Dollar Tree. I was just wandering around looking, trying to figure out how to get a nice 3D shape, and these were perfect and very budget friendly. Hot glue is how I attached these, which worked out great until I burned myself many times trying to wrap the fabric around. There's really no method to this process. I was just gluing and trimming and gluing some more until I was happy with the way the gumdrop buttons looked. The final step of this process is to add the icing to the gingerbread man. I found the squiggle shapes in Cricut Design Space. They were originally an earring template, but I just measured them and sized them to the size I would need for Gingy. I think I flipped some upside down so that they wouldn't be the exact same squiggle all over, so they weren't quite symmetrical, because what cookie has symmetrical icing? For material, I used this white heat transfer vinyl, and I think it gave a nice shine on stage. We're on to finishing touches, committing to the placement of the eyebrows, and I was very nervous to put the heat transfer vinyl on because there's no going back at this point, but I figured I would just make it work with however it turned out, and luckily it turned out great. Similar to the eyes, I wanted to make sure that the gumdrop buttons were gonna stay. We cannot have them falling off. And so I both sewed and hot glued them just to make sure that they were gonna be durable for the whole run of the performance, and we can't lose those gumdrop buttons, not the gumdrop buttons. Can't even begin to tell you the relief I felt when this project was finally complete. All the steps, all the many hours of trial and error, and now we finally have Gingy the gingerbread man. The end! Thank you so much for joining us on this journey, and I hope that if you are making your own Gingy puppet, that you found this a little bit helpful.
Let us know down in the comments if you've made any props or puppets like this one. We'd love to hear about it.